Chapter 8. Marius and Cosette. Not wishing to give evidence against Thénardier in court, Marius made immediate arrangements to leave his room. Early the following morning, he paid the concierge his final rent and went to live with his friend Enjolras. Inspector Javert looked for Marius everywhere, but without success. 2 months later, Marius was deeply unhappy. He sent money every Monday to Thénardier, who was in prison, which meant that he had even less money for himself. But the main reason for his unhappiness was that he was forced to live his life with no hope of seeing Ursula. One afternoon he was sitting in a field looking down at a small river, when his dreams of Ursula were suddenly broken by the sound of a familiar voice. He looked up and recognized Éponine, Thénardier's elder daughter. Still wearing the same rags, with the same bold look in her eyes and the same rough voice, she had somehow become more beautiful. She stared at Marius with a look of pleasure on her pale face, and for some moments seemed unable to speak. "So, at last I've found you," she finally said. "I've been looking for you everywhere. You aren't living in the same room any more?" "No," said Marius. "Well, I can understand that. It's not nice, that sort of thing. But why are you wearing that dirty old hat?" When Marius gave no answer, she went on, "And you've got a hole in your shirt. I'll mend it for you. A young man like you ought to be nicely dressed." Marius still said nothing, and after a moment's pause she said, "You don't seem very glad to see me. But I could make you look happy if I wanted to." "How?" said Marius. "What do you mean?" "You weren't so unfriendly last time." "I'm sorry. But what do you mean?" She bit her lip and hesitated, as if trying to make up her mind about something. Finally she said, "I've got the address." Marius's heart seemed to miss a beat. "You mean the address you wanted me to find out? The young lady, you know." Her voice sank into a sigh. Marius jumped up and took her by the hand. "Let's go at once," he cried, wild with excitement. Then he suddenly frowned and seized Éponine by the arm. "But you must promise me," he said, "that you'll never tell your father the address." "I promise," the girl replied, staring at Marius with amusement. They had only gone a few steps when Éponine stopped and said, "You remember you promised me something?" Marius felt in his pocket. All he had in the world was the 5-franc piece he intended to give her father in prison. He pushed it into her hand, but she opened her fingers and let the coin fall to the ground. She looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and sadness in her eyes. "I don't want your money," she said. That evening, Cosette was alone in the house which Jean Valjean had bought about a year earlier. It was a small house in a back street, with a large wild garden. Valjean had gone away on business for a couple of days, and Cosette was in the downstairs sitting-room, playing the piano. Suddenly she thought she heard the sound of footsteps in the garden. She listened at the window for a minute, then ran up to her bedroom, opened the window, and looked out. The moonlit garden and the street beyond it were completely empty. Cosette, not a nervous girl by nature, smiled to herself and thought no more about it. The next evening, as she was walking in the garden, she was sure that she heard someone moving in the trees. Again, when she looked round, she saw nothing. When Jean Valjean returned from his business the following day, Cosette told him about the noises in the garden. He told her not to worry, but she noticed an anxious look in his eyes. He spent the next 2 nights walking around the garden, checking the gate, listening for noises. but nothing unusual happened. Then, one morning a few days later, Cosette noticed a large stone lying on the garden bench. Nervously, she picked it up and discovered an envelope underneath it. Inside, there was a small notebook filled with love poems. Cosette sat down and began to read, enjoying the music of the language and the beauty of the handwriting. She had never read anything like this before, and it affected her deeply. Her heart on fire, she took the notebook upstairs to her bedroom and read every word again. She remembered the handsome young man she had seen so often in the Luxembourg Gardens. As she read the notebook, she knew in her heart that he was the author of these beautiful romantic words. Finally, she kissed the book, held it to her heart, and waited for the evening, when she knew that something special was going to occur. That evening, Jean Valjean went out. Cosette spent a long time in front of the mirror, making her hair look beautiful and deciding which dress to wear. Finally, she went out into the garden. She sat on the bench where she had found the notebook, and moments later had the strange feeling that she was being watched. She looked round and jumped to her feet. It was he. He looked paler and thinner than she remembered. His dark clothes were almost invisible in the shadows, and his face shone softly in the fading light. Cosette felt suddenly faint, but she did not move or make a sound. "Forgive me for being here," Marius spoke at last, "but I've been so unhappy. Do you recognize me? You mustn't be afraid. It's a long time ago, but do you remember the day when you first looked at me, in the Luxembourg Gardens, and the day you walked past me? Those things happened nearly a year ago. Forgive me for talking like this. I don't know what I'm saying. Perhaps I'm annoying you. But the truth is, I can't live without you." "Mother," Cosette murmured, and began to fall. Marius caught her and held her tightly in his arms without realizing what he was doing, lost in a mist of love. Cosette, feeling her body close to his, took his hand and pressed it against her heart. Aware of the shape of the notebook under her dress, he said, "So you've read my notebook? Do you love me too?" "Of course," she answered in a low voice. "You know I do." Then, as if by magic, her lips were next to his, and they were kissing. Afterwards, they sat together on the garden bench in a state of shock, neither of them speaking. Beneath the stars, they were happy just to look into each other's eyes and hold each other's hands. Then, at last, they began to speak. They talked all evening about their dreams, their mistakes, their moments of happiness, their moments of despair. When everything had been said, she laid her head on his shoulder and asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Marius." "And yours?" "Cosette." During that month of May, in the year 1832, Cosette and Marius met every day in the wild garden of that small, secret house. They would sit and hold hands and talk, or just gaze into each other's eyes and smile. "How lovely you are," Marius would sigh. "There are moments when I think this is a dream. There are other moments when I think I'm a little mad. I love you so much." To which Cosette would reply, "I love you more with every minute that passes." In this way, bathed in happiness, they lived untroubled by the world. One beautiful starry evening, Marius found Cosette sitting unhappily in her garden. "What's the matter?" he asked, sitting next to her on the bench. "My father said that we may have to leave," she replied. Marius trembled. For 6 weeks he had known nothing but uncomplicated happiness. Now, for the first time, there was a cloud in the clear blue sky of his life. He could not speak, and Cosette felt his hand grow cold. She asked, as he had done, "What's the matter?" He replied in a voice so low that she could hardly hear it, "I don't understand what you mean." "Father told me this morning that I have to pack everything and be ready to leave for England within a week." Marius rose to his feet and said coldly, "Cosette, are you going?" She looked up at him, her pale face lined with misery. "What else can I do?" she cried. "So you're leaving me?" "Oh, Marius, why are you being so cruel to me?" Marius turned his back to her and said, "Then I shall have to go away." "No, Marius, wait. I've got an idea." Marius turned and was surprised to see her smiling. "What is it?" "If we go, you must come too. I'll tell you where, and you must meet me there, wherever it is." "How can I possibly do that?" he cried. "Are you crazy? You need money to go to England, and I haven't got any. I haven't told you, Cosette, but I'm a poor man. I wear a cheap hat. My jacket has lost half its buttons, and there are holes in my boots." He turned away from her and stood with his face pressed to the trunk of a tree, almost ready to faint. He stayed in that position for some time. Finally, he heard a small sound behind him, and turning round, he saw that Cosette was in tears. He fell on his knees in front of her and pressed her hand to his lips. "Don't cry," he said. "I cannot let you leave me. I promise you that if you leave me, I shall die. But listen to me. I have a plan. Don't expect me here tomorrow." "Why not?" Cosette said, drying her tears. "A whole day without seeing you, that's unbearable." "It's worth losing a day together if we want to be happy for the rest of our lives." "But what are you going to do?" "Wait until the day after tomorrow. I'll tell you then. But until then, I must give you my address. I'm living with a friend of mine, Enjolras." Marius then took a knife out of his pocket and scratched his address on the wall. 16 Rue de la Verrerie. "Please, Marius," Cosette said as she watched him. "Where are you going tomorrow evening? I won't be able to sleep if you don't tell me." "I'm going to try something." "Well, I'll pray for you to succeed, and I'll never stop thinking about you. I'll ask no more questions, but you must promise to be here early the day after tomorrow, not later than 9 o'clock. "I promise," Marius said.